Dr. Sarah Chen had been warned about the wildlife on Kepler 442b before she accepted the xenobiology research position. The planet's gravity was lighter than Earth's, making everything move with an unsettling bounce. The air was breathable, but carried strange scents that reminded her of burnt copper and wet moss. What nobody had mentioned was how the local predators would react to human presence. The research station sat in a clearing, surrounded by towering purple trees that swayed without any wind. Sarah had been on the planet for 3 weeks, collecting samples and documenting the bizarre ecosystem. The other researchers kept to the main compound, but Sarah preferred the smaller outpost lab, where she could work without interruption. The isolation suited her, or so she thought. It started with scratching sounds outside her sleeping quarters. At first, she assumed it was the wind moving debris across the metal walls. The station's AI assured her that the perimeter sensors detected no large life forms. But the scratching continued, growing bolder each night. Sometimes she heard what sounded like purring, deep and rumbling, unlike any Earth cat she'd ever known. On the 4th night of disturbances, Sarah decided to investigate. She activated the exterior cameras and nearly dropped her tablet. 3 creatures sat outside her window, staring directly at the lens. They looked like a cross between a panther and a bear, with 6 legs and fur that shifted colors like oil on water. Each one was roughly the size of a large dog, but their eyes held an intelligence that made Sarah's skin crawl. The station's database identified them as apex stalkers, the planet's primary predator species. Adult specimens could grow to the size of Earth elephants and were known to hunt in coordinated packs. These appeared to be juveniles. But even young apex stalkers were considered extremely dangerous. The entry warned that they showed no fear of technology and possessed problem-solving abilities that surpassed most Earth primates. Sarah checked her weapon locker and found only a standard-issue stun rod and emergency flare gun. The research station wasn't equipped for combat, relying instead on sonic barriers and automated defenses. She activated every security protocol available, flooding the area around her quarters with high-frequency sound waves that were supposed to repel local wildlife. The cubs didn't even flinch. Over the next hour, Sarah watched in fascination and growing alarm as the 3 creatures systematically tested every entrance to her section of the station. They worked together, one distracting the motion sensors, while another probed for weaknesses. The third seemed to be studying the building's structure, occasionally standing on its hind legs to examine higher windows. When the main power grid suddenly shut down, Sarah knew she was in serious trouble. The cubs had somehow disabled the station's primary systems. Emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie red glow as backup power kicked in. The sonic barriers fell silent, and Sarah heard the unmistakable sound of claws on metal. She grabbed her emergency kit and barricaded herself in the sleeping quarters. The room had reinforced walls and only one entrance, which she blocked with her desk and equipment locker. Her hands shook as she tried to contact the main compound, but the communication array was offline. The cubs had been more thorough than she'd realized. A soft thud against the outer door made her heart race. Then another. The creatures were testing the barrier, learning its structure and weak points. Sarah activated her personal beacon, hoping the signal would reach the main station. The nearest help was 15 kilometers away through hostile terrain. The scratching started again, but this time it came from above. The cubs had found access to the maintenance crawl space above the ceiling. Sarah listened to them moving overhead, their weight making the metal groan and flex. Dust rained down as they searched for another way in. She retreated to her bed, which sat in the corner farthest from both the door and the suspicious ceiling tiles. Her emergency kit contained basic medical supplies, water purification tablets, and a few days' worth of rations. There was also something else, something she'd almost forgotten about. At the bottom of the kit, wrapped in a cloth that had seen better days, was her grandmother's hammer. It was an old-fashioned claw hammer with a wooden handle worn smooth by decades of use. Sarah's grandmother had been a carpenter in rural Montana, and she'd given Sarah the tool when she left for university. Sometimes, the old woman had said, The old ways work better than all that fancy technology. Sarah had carried the hammer through 4 years of college, graduate school, and 3 off-world assignments. It was more sentimental than practical, a reminder of home and family. She'd never actually used it for anything more demanding than hanging pictures in her various living spaces. The ceiling tile above her bed suddenly shifted, and a pair of glowing eyes peered through the gap. Sarah froze, barely breathing as the creature studied her. Its head was larger than she'd expected, with a skull that looked designed for crushing bone. The eyes were a deep, amber color, and seemed to glow with their own light. The creature made a sound, something between a chirp and a growl. Almost immediately, the other 2 cubs appeared at different points in the ceiling. They were communicating, sharing information about their discovery. Sarah realized that they'd been planning this approach for some time, possibly since they first detected her presence. One of the ceiling tiles gave way completely, crashing to the floor with a metallic clang. The largest cub dropped through the opening, landing with surprising grace despite the low gravity. It was even more impressive up close, with muscles that rippled beneath its color-shifting fur. The other 2 cubs followed, forming a loose triangle around Sarah's position. Sarah gripped the hammer handle, feeling the familiar weight and texture of the worn wood. Her grandmother had built houses with this tool, creating shelter and safety for her family. Now it was Sarah's turn to defend her home, even if that home was a prefabricated research station on an alien world. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Sarah held the hammer steady, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. The 3 cubs watched her with those unsettling amber eyes, their heads moving in small, synchronized motions as if they were silently discussing strategy. The lead cub took another step forward, and Sarah swung the hammer through the air in a warning arc. The wooden handle made a soft whooshing sound, and all 3 predators immediately froze. Their ears flattened against their skulls, and their fur began to shift to darker colors. Sarah had their attention. What happened next surprised everyone in the room, including Sarah herself. Instead of attacking, the lead cub sat down. Its hindquarters touched the floor with a soft thump, and it continued to stare at the hammer with what could only be described as curiosity. The other 2 cubs exchanged glances, and also settled into sitting positions. Sarah blinked in confusion. These were supposed to be deadly apex predators, not oversized house cats. She kept the hammer raised, but began to wonder if she was misreading the situation entirely. The cubs weren't showing signs of aggression anymore. If anything, they seemed almost respectful. A memory surfaced from her xenobiology training. Many predator species used ritualized displays to establish dominance without actual violence. Perhaps the hammer, with its simple but effective design, represented something the cubs could recognize and understand. It was a tool, clearly crafted for a purpose, held by a creature who knew how to use it. Sarah lowered the hammer slowly, keeping it ready but not actively threatening. The lead cub's ears perked up, and its fur began to shift back to lighter colors. It made a soft sound, something between a purr and a trill, and the other cubs responded with similar vocalizations. "Are you trying to communicate with me?" Sarah asked aloud, feeling slightly ridiculous for talking to alien predators. The sound of her voice made all 3 cubs tilt their heads in unison, an action so synchronized it was almost comical. The lead cub stood and approached Sarah's bed, stopping just outside of hammer range. It sat again and began to make a series of different sounds, varying the pitch and tone as if experimenting with language. Sarah found herself responding instinctively, making encouraging noises when the cub produced particularly melodic sounds. This continued for several minutes until Sarah realized what was happening. The cubs weren't trying to eat her. They were trying to learn from her. The attack on the station's power systems hadn't been predatory behavior. It had been the actions of intelligent juveniles who wanted to study the strange new creatures that had appeared in their territory. Sarah climbed down from her bed, keeping the hammer visible but non-threatening. The cubs watched every movement with intense focus, occasionally making notes to each other in their musical language. When Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, all 3 cubs immediately moved closer, forming a loose circle around her. The nearest cub, smaller than the others and with particularly vibrant fur patterns, reached out with one six-toed paw and gently touched the hammer's head. Sarah allowed the contact, watching as the creature explored the tool's texture and weight. Its claws were retracted, and it handled the hammer with surprising delicacy. "This belonged to my grandmother," Sarah said, not caring if the cubs understood her words. "She built things with it. Houses, furniture, anything her family needed. She was tougher than a mountain, and twice as stubborn." The cubs listened to her voice, their heads swaying slightly, as if they were following the rhythm of her speech. The one touching the hammer made a soft, inquiring sound, and Sarah found herself continuing the story. Grandma Chen came to America with nothing but determination, and this hammer. She worked construction jobs that nobody thought a woman could handle. When people told her she was too small or too weak, she'd just smile and keep building. She always said that respect isn't given. It's earned one project at a time. As Sarah spoke, she began to understand something profound about the cubs' behavior. They had tested the station's defenses not to attack, but to measure the inhabitants' capabilities. Finding mostly automated systems and standard technology, they had been unimpressed. But the hammer represented something different: human ingenuity, determination, and the willingness to face danger with simple tools and personal courage. The lead cub began to purr, a deep rumbling sound that made Sarah's chest vibrate. It was a sound of contentment and approval, and the other cubs joined in until the room filled with harmonic vibrations. Sarah felt some of her fear melting away, replaced by wonder at this unexpected connection. Movement in her peripheral vision caught Sarah's attention. Through the hole in the ceiling, she could see larger shapes moving in the darkness above. The adult apex stalkers had arrived, drawn by their cub's absence from the territory. Sarah's blood turned cold as she realized the true magnitude of her situation. The cubs sensed the change immediately. Their purring stopped, and they moved to position themselves between Sarah and the ceiling opening. The lead cub stood and made a complex series of sounds toward the darkness above. Sounds that carried authority despite coming from a juvenile. A massive head appeared in the opening, easily 3 times the size of the cubs' heads. Golden eyes that seemed to burn with their own fire fixed on Sarah, and she felt the weight of an intelligence that was both alien and ancient. The adult stalker could have torn through the ceiling or walls without effort, but it remained motionless. Watching and listening, the lead cub continued its vocalizations, occasionally gesturing toward Sarah and the hammer. The adult's massive head tilted as it considered whatever argument the young predator was making. Sarah had the distinct impression that her fate was being decided in a language she couldn't understand, in a trial she hadn't known she was part of. After what felt like an eternity, the adult stalker made a single, deep sound that resonated through the station's metal walls. The cubs immediately relaxed, their fur shifting to brighter, more playful colors. Whatever judgment had been passed, Sarah had apparently survived it. The adult withdrew, and Sarah heard the sound of multiple large bodies moving away through the maintenance spaces above. The immediate danger had passed, but Sarah knew her relationship with the planet's dominant predators had fundamentally changed. The smallest cub approached, and gentle dawn on Kepler 442b brought twin suns that painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sarah woke to find all 3 cubs curled around her sleeping area, their breathing creating a soft symphony of contentment. During the night, they had somehow restored power to her section of the station, though Sarah couldn't begin to guess how they'd managed it. The largest cub stirred as Sarah sat up, immediately alert despite having been fast asleep moments before. It made a questioning trill, and Sarah found herself responding with a reassuring hum. Somewhere during the night, they had developed a basic form of communication that transcended species barriers. Sarah's communication device crackled to life with urgent messages from the main compound. Dr. Harrison's voice carried barely controlled panic as he reported massive predator movements throughout the night. Search and rescue teams were preparing to investigate her station, assuming the worst when her emergency beacon had gone silent. "Base camp. This is Chen," Sarah transmitted. watching the cubs perk up at the sound of her voice. "I'm safe and secure. No assistance required." The response was immediate and disbelieving. "Sarah, your entire sector went dark for 8 hours. We detected at least 6 adult stalkers converging on your position. How is that possible?" Sarah looked at her 3 companions, who were listening to the radio conversation with obvious intelligence. The smallest one had positioned itself near the communication device and seemed to be studying the patterns of human speech coming through the speakers. "I made contact with a family group," Sarah said carefully. "The juveniles were investigating our presence, not hunting. It was a cultural exchange, not an attack." The silence from base camp stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if her transmission had been lost. When Dr. Harrison finally responded, his voice carried the careful tone of someone speaking to a potentially unstable person. "Sarah, you need to return to base immediately. Stalkers don't make cultural exchanges. They're apex predators. You may be experiencing some form of psychological trauma or alien influence." The lead cub made a sound that Sarah had learned meant amusement. It was apparently finding the human conversation entertaining. Sarah realized that trying to explain the night's events would be futile without evidence that her colleagues could accept. "I'm going to send you some video documentation," Sarah said, activating her portable recording device. "I want you to see this before you send in any rescue teams." She filmed the cubs as they demonstrated their intelligence, showing how they had repaired the power systems and how they responded to her voice with coordinated movements that were clearly communicative. The footage captured their color-changing abilities and the complex social interactions between the 3 individuals. The most compelling evidence came when Sarah held up her grandmother's hammer and asked the cubs to show how they perceived it. All 3 creatures immediately adopted respectful postures, and the lead cub began to vocalize in patterns that resembled human tool-making rhythms. They understood the hammer not just as an object, but as a symbol of craftsmanship and cultural heritage. "This is impossible." Dr. Harrison's voice crackled through the communicator after reviewing the footage. "Stalkers have never shown this level of social complexity. You're describing behavior that would require near-human intelligence." Sarah was about to respond when the cubs suddenly became alert, their ears swiveling toward the entrance to the station. A new sound reached Sarah's ears, the distinctive whine of the research team's hovercrafts approaching through the forest. The rescue mission was already en route. The lead cub made a series of urgent sounds to its companions, and all 3 moved to the windows facing the incoming vehicles. Their behavior shifted dramatically, becoming more predatory and defensive. Sarah realized that they viewed the approaching humans as a potential threat to their new relationship with her. "Base camp. Abort the rescue mission," Sarah transmitted urgently. "I repeat, do not approach this station with armed vehicles. The stalkers will interpret that as an attack." "Negative, Sarah. We're bringing you home." Dr. Williams is concerned about possible alien mental influence or contamination. The mission continues. Through the window, Sarah could see the lead hovercraft cresting the hill that overlooked her station. Its mounted stun cannons were clearly visible, and she knew the cubs could see them too. The tension in the room became palpable as her 3 companions prepared to defend what they now considered their territory. Sarah made a decision that would change xenobiology protocols forever. She stepped outside the station, carrying her grandmother's hammer, and positioned herself between the approaching vehicles and the building that contained the cubs. When the lead hovercraft landed, she was waiting for them. Dr. Harrison emerged from the vehicle along with 2 security officers in full protective gear. They moved cautiously, clearly expecting to find either Sarah's remains or evidence of a psychotic break. Instead, they found her standing calmly in the morning light, looking more confident than she had since arriving on the planet. "Sarah, thank God you're alive," Harrison said, relief evident in his voice. "We need to get you back to base for medical evaluation. Whatever happened here, we'll sort it out safely." "Nothing happened to me, James," Sarah replied. "Something happened for me. These creatures aren't just predators. They're people." As if summoned by her words, the 3 cubs emerged from the station. They moved with careful dignity, forming a protective formation around Sarah, while keeping their claws retracted and their postures non-threatening. The security officers immediately raised their weapons, but Sarah stepped forward with the hammer held high. "Anyone who wants to harm these beings will have to go through me first," she declared, her voice carrying the same determination that had driven her grandmother to succeed in a hostile world. "They're intelligent, they're peaceful, and they've chosen to trust humanity. I won't let that trust be betrayed." The standoff that followed lasted only moments, but Sarah felt the weight of interspecies relations balanced on the edge of her grandmother's hammer. Dr. Harrison studied the cubs with growing amazement as he realized that their movements showed clear signs of language and complex reasoning. The largest cub broke the tension by approaching Harrison with deliberate slowness. It sat down just outside arm's reach and made the same respectful vocalization it had used when first seeing the hammer. Then it did something that left everyone speechless. It bowed its head in what was unmistakably a gesture of greeting. Harrison looked from the cub to Sarah, to the hammer in her hands. When he spoke, his voice carried wonder instead of fear. "My God, Sarah! What have you discovered?" Over the following hours, Sarah documented the first peaceful contact between humanity and the apex stalkers of Kepler 442b. The cubs served as translators and cultural ambassadors, helping both species understand that intelligence and civilization could take forms that neither had initially recognized. The hammer became a symbol of that first contact, representing the human values of craftsmanship, determination, and the courage to stand your ground when defending what matters. When the formal first contact protocols were established months later, they included provisions for the exchange of simple tools as gestures of respect and understanding. Sarah's grandmother had never imagined that her old carpenter's hammer would become one of the most famous artifacts in xenodiplomacy. But she would have understood perfectly why it worked. Sometimes the old ways really were better than all the fancy technology, especially when what you needed wasn't better weapons or stronger defenses, but the courage to treat strangers as potential friends. The cubs never left Sarah's side during her remaining time on Kepler 442b. When she was eventually reassigned to a diplomatic post facilitating human-stalker relations, they insisted on coming with her. The galaxy, it turned out, was full of opportunities for a xenobiologist, 3 alien ambassadors, and 1 very special hammer. Years later, when young diplomats asked Sarah about the secret to successful first contact, she would smile and tell them about her grandmother's wisdom. "Respect isn't given," she would say, hefting the worn wooden handle of the hammer that had changed everything. "It's earned one project at a time." The apex stalkers had their own saying, translated from their musical language. "True strength is shown not in how fiercely you can fight, but in how wisely you choose not to." It was a lesson that both species learned together, in a small research station where 3 curious cubs climbed onto a human's bed and discovered that sometimes the scariest-looking strangers make the best friends. In the end, Sarah's grandmother had been right about more than just tools. Sometimes the old ways of treating others with respect and standing up for what you believe in really are better than all the fancy technology in the galaxy. And sometimes, all it takes to change the universe is one person willing to face the unknown, with courage, and an old hammer passed down through generations of builders. Why bumped its head against Sarah's leg, a gesture that reminded her of an affectionate cat. She reached out slowly and touched its fur, finding it surprisingly soft despite its otherworldly appearance. The creature purred again, and Sarah realized she had just been adopted by 3 alien apex predators. As the emergency lighting continued to cast its red glow through the station, Sarah looked at her grandmother's hammer and smiled. The old woman had been right about the old ways sometimes being better than fancy technology. In this case, a simple tool and the courage to face danger had opened a door to understanding between species separated by millions of years of evolution. The cubs settled around her, their presence now comforting rather than threatening. Sarah knew that when morning came, she would have an incredible story to tell. More importantly, she would have allies on a world that had seemed impossibly hostile just hours before. LD. The cubs began to advance, moving with the coordinated precision of experienced hunters. They were young, but they were still apex predators on a planet where few things survived without being very, very dangerous. Sarah stood up on her bed, raising the hammer in what she hoped was a threatening manner. The lead cub paused, tilting its head as it studied the strange object in the human's hands. It had encountered the metal tools and energy weapons of the research station. But this was something different. The hammer radiated a simplicity and purpose that seemed to confuse the intelligent predator. Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to fight for her life with a piece of earth steel and Montana pine.